I am a lawyer who was trained at a big law firm working for Fortune 100 companies and worked on the Madoff Ponzi scheme recovery. I have my own practice now where I work with a lot of tech businesses as well as other businesses that are dealing with tech issues, helping them with their contract negotiation and drafting, as well as legal compliance issues. So today we're going to be talking about AI, emerging tech, and the law. It's an area where there's still a lot of gray and unclarity and is being kind of figured out in the courts as we go along. So what are some of the positives that AI brings? One, there's going to be increased automation of route and simple tasks as there's creation of more efficiencies and speed in our transactions. Additionally, we'll have replacement of human labor for physically intensive and dangerous tasks. This way, we're having a reduction in workplace injuries. Moreover, we're having more precision in many difficult tasks, such as medical treatments and procedures, which will also allow us to have longer and more healthy lives. Then we have widespread adoption of autonomous vehicle, which will transform not only the transportation industry, but also just how we commute and how we see efficiencies in our roads. Finally, we're going to have a redefining of our own roles in the workplace and society, since these fourth industrial revolution technologies, AI, blockchain, IoT, become widely adopted and instituted, we'll have a new understanding of what it means for us to be working and being employees. What are some of the challenges with AI? Well, one, there are social and ethical considerations with adoption of artificial intelligence. There's economic impacts that we need to consider. There's intellectual property considerations, privacy considerations, and liability considerations. So these are things we're going to get into individually. So there's a whole host of social and ethical considerations. Some examples are, think about the use of facial recognition software for identification purposes. The technology as it currently exists has higher error rates with respect to identification of minorities and women, so that creates issues such as discriminatory purposes for the use of the AI. An example of this would be in New York last year, an apartment building has decided to adopt facial recognition for allowing tenants entrance into the building. So given that this technology is still not accurate and misidentifies minorities and women, you would have a higher instance of these tenants being precluded from entrance into their home, and then that's a violation of the law there. You're creating a situation that's not only discriminatory, but you're actually denying them access to their apartment, which is illegal. A second issue with a social ethical consideration is that there are implicit biases built into AI algorithms often. So there's both the AI developers have their own implicit biases that they'll work in to the algorithm that they may not even realize they have. In addition, the data that's being fed to the AI contains biases. So for example, think about that as the criminal justice system. Right? It's full of biases already. There's prejudice against minorities in that system. And if you take data from that has minorities being arrested in a larger number for minor crimes than other groups, you then see a situation where if you're using an algorithm, you have a situation where a minority may be identified more likely as a criminal, which is not based on a biased data set. So that's discriminatory again. And when that is happening, they don't have an opportunity to challenge that, right? If the AI is just making the recommendation or the decision and it's being followed. Then we have increased autonomous weaponry that can lead to a worldwide autonomous weapons race. So this is especially likely in countries like Russia, who Putin has said that he wants to be a leader in AI and blockchain, and particularly in the weapons industry. So as we see more and more countries adopting this autonomous weaponry, we see situations where since it's not combat is now not hand in hand. There's less and less every day of a kind of impact that people are seeing on a day-to-day basis. So it kind of increases that danger, as well as the danger that people are just not realizing the impact of this kind of war. Finally, we have increased spreading of misinformation through bots, because that can lead to social and political impacts. So one way to think of this was what happened with Cambridge Analytica, right? And that wasn't even full AI yet, but they were using the AI to kind of process people's data and then be able to send out, basically messages that they knew people would be manipulated by. So there'll be increased use of that as we move forward. Another example of that is the deep fakes. So people are going to create more of those, and that will be an issue where, potentially candidates for office will have videos out that are not actually them claiming to make controversial statements, and then they'll have to somehow disprove that. And that technology is still difficult at this point. Another area of consideration is the economic impacts we were talking about. So the growth of AI is going to be exponential in the next few decades. Some stats say that by 2040 or 2050, there's going to be 50% unemployment. So job loss from AI is going to significantly outpace jobs created by the AI, and governments aren't really adapting to deal with that. They're not putting in the appropriate forethought right now. How do we deal with mass employment that's coming down the line? And this is not a new concept. This has happened with other industrial revolutions, but they have not been as exponential as this fourth industrial revolution is going to be, with all the adoption of all this emerging tech. And ways that some governments or states have tried to address the situation doesn't necessarily make sense. For example, in Oregon, they have statutorily through laws preserved people pumping gas for you, right? They've preserved this industry that shouldn't exist just through laws. I don't necessarily think that's a kind of good way to address some of the economic impacts by preserving industries that should be made obsolete, but there needs to be more considerations about how do we actually address some of these issues. So, it may be through UBI, Universal Basic Income, to give everyone a kind of minimum amount that they can live off, and then they can figure out freelance jobs on top of that to be able to address the hardship that's created by not having full-time jobs, as more and more people kind of transition into this freelance gig economy created by a lot of this technological innovation. Additionally, universal healthcare would again come into that too, because as people don't have traditional jobs, they're not going to have employer-based healthcare. So we need considerations about how do we address some of these issues with a growing amount of unemployment. We also have intellectual property considerations with AI. And this is on multiple different grounds that we have such a consideration. So one is for AI platforms or services, traditional intellectual property rights apply, and those rights are very important for companies in this space. So it's important for them to have well-drafted agreements to preserve their intellectual property rights and the value of their platform. If you do not protect those rights, you will be assigning away your intellectual property to potentially every customer that you have. And at that point, you don't actually have a valuable product or algorithm ref, because you've assigned those rights and given them away to other parties. And now they can compete and create the same intellectual property independently. Another thing to remember with all these kind of platform applications is that it's not only the algorithm that's important, but actually the data sets are important. And that's an issue where there may be divisions on who owns one, right? Because if you're the algorithm, the platform provider, you own the platform, you may not own the data that's being fed into it. Your customer is feeding you the data, right? And you're processing it for them. You're providing them analytics. So that creates a situation where you have to be careful about how data is addressed, and data rights as well as data privacy. There's also a new frontier of AI-created inventions. So think of this as AI-generated music, AI-generated code. So this is basically an AI is creating something instead of a human or a human-driven kind of production. So now you're having a machine create what is traditionally intellectual property, but machines can't really hold or traditionally haven't held intellectual property rights, right? They don't own anything. So you create this issue of, well, if you create an algorithm and the algorithm creates new intellectual property, uh, is can you get protection for that? Is that an area where you will be able to assign protection, or because it is an AI that's created it, there is no protection for that, and it's free for everyone to use. So that's an area that's going to continue to be developed in the courts, that we get more and more AI kind of generated, copyrighted and trademarked and patent materials. AI can also be used for intellectual property administration. So this would mean, for example, in the registration process, in searches and all of that. However, there are complexities involved with this. For example, intellectual property, is basically in a lot of cases global, right? You're having a client base if you're an AI company, in the EU, in the US, in Canada. However, intellectual property laws are not global. They're jurisdictionally based. They're unique to every country. So you have this complex kind of framework where you have to fit in your intellectual property, and it's hard to think about how you're going to get a global framework to be able to administer IP rights that way. You have to get all these governments on board. So ways that this may work is whether you do it, through local organizations, like if the USPTO adopted more of this, you'd have US administration through an AI-based system. You can get some of the international organizations involved to try to help streamline this, but there are complexities there that need to be still determined given this kind of conflict of the multiple laws in play. Another issue with AI and intellectual property is that when you are having an AI autonomously kind of run, you can have it basically use its algorithm to autonomously infringe on someone else's intellectual property. So you may not be aware, but there may be something in the code that made it infringe on someone else's intellectual property, and then there's potential liability there, which we'll discuss further down the road. But once you have that liability, it can tie back to you, since you're the creator of the AI. So another area we were talking about is privacy. So more and more data is being fed into AI platforms and algorithms. Ownership of that data is very important, and there's multiple laws that govern that data and how it's treated when it's being processed and the analytics are being done on it. So there is the EU's Global Data Protection Regulation that applies. There is, for example, the California Consumer Privacy Act that's going into effect 2020 that's applying, and businesses are starting to have to adopt to. There's also high-tech and HIPAA laws that deal with medical information privacy protection. All of these are important because it involves the agreements that you have to have in place if you are a platform that's using AI to do analytics for other businesses, right? You're taking in their data, and you need to be able to process that data. But to be able to process that data, you became a data processor, and you're liable for these laws even though you may not be the person who's actually gathering the data initially. That means you have to follow all of these. You have to have data processing agreements in place that address GDPR and CCPA. You need to have business associate agreements in place to deal with any of the medical information issues. Additionally, if you have vendors as well, so if you are, so you have someone who's providing you some kind of tech services, some kind of analytics, or any kind of tech service where they're getting the data that you get from your consumer, you have an additional level of data processing agreements and business associate agreements you have to get with your vendors. So it becomes a chain, in everyone who's touching this data has to have the appropriate agreements in place, and they're acting as both a processor of the data as well as a controller of the data at the same time, if you're in the middle of the chain versus at the very end or at the beginning. Another issue that kind of rises with these AI platforms is a lot of them would often like to get some of the analytics to keep for themselves, right? To be able to further develop their algorithm. And they try to do that to anonymization of data. So they take out the identifying factors. Again, that's something that you may or may not be able to do, and to the degree will be determined by both the applicable laws as well as the agreements you have in place with your vendors and your customers. So there are other privacy considerations that go into place. So one thing that is just happening with more and more adoption of this emerging tech is decreasing individual privacy. So there is AI analysis of everyone's individual online behavior that's occurring. And this reveals everything from political beliefs, religious affiliations, race, ethnicity, health conditions, gender, and sexual orientation. Even if that's not something you've actually shared with anyone, right? So they're kind of being able to know your inner thoughts. You know, one way I like to think of it, they can know you better than your own mother, right? Because they know what you're thinking, even though you may have not known it and told anyone else what you may be thinking. Additionally, increased use of Internet of Things devices increases this collection of data on individuals. And it increases it over both multiple devices and multiple locations. So now they have a full picture of what your interests are, what you do, everything that they could be gathered about you. Something that we've not, this is a new challenge that we're dealing with, this increasing kind of data that everyone has on us and is able to use to basically inform our decisions and try to get us to buy things and manipulate us into making certain decisions. So with this decreasing, basically, privacy of individuals, what are some of the compromises of privacy that come into play with this? So one of the issues is data exploitation. So many people are actually unaware of how much data is being collected on them, right? They don't understand that their phone has where they are down to the minute and is sharing that with Apple. They don't understand they have Alexas in their homes. They don't understand what data is being collected by that. They have no understanding. They just see the convenience of having these devices and don't realize the kind of consequences in terms of privacy and what they're giving up, right? Additionally, there is identification and tracking issues. So this identification and tracking and monitoring of individuals across these multiple devices and locations creates an issue where even if the company or the data processors had anonymized it, you basically become, they are able to backtrack and kind of identify you again, right? Because they have this info over so many devices and locations, they're able to pinpoint the individuals. So there is no anonymity really anymore, right? Even if they claim that it is anonymous, it really isn't. They're able to identify individuals. There's also, with voice and facial recognition, there's issues that there's kind of circumvention of legal procedure with use of those technologies. So they're able to find, police can find individuals through smart devices. For example, smart cameras are getting prevalent now, right? And certain countries like in Europe have CTV, so there's always video. And so now they're able, with the facial recognition software, be like, oh, that's a potential suspect. Now we know where they are. They can go in and locate them. Additionally with that, there is issues with unlocking devices without consent. So traditionally, if you went to the airport, and the border patrol wants you to unlock, or a police person wants you to unlock your phone, they couldn't force you to put your finger down, right? So with that kind of biometric, you still had to consent to basically unlocking the phone. Well, with a lot of the facial recognition software, you don't actually have to consent. They can hold it up to your face, right? It'll unlock. So that step of consent and not being forced to unlock it has kind of been removed, right? So it's interesting in that sense. It's easier for them to get around the law. Additional kind of issues there is that they've a privacy consideration that's very interesting is that traditionally privacy doesn't last after you die, right? So police have now been trying to unlock phones with the biometrics of bodies. So with putting the phone or the fingers down after they find a dead body and trying to unlock it, it's not the success of that is kind of not very great because it's not a warm body anymore necessarily if it's been there for a while, so they can't really unlock the phone. But the fact that they're doing that creates these issues about, well, are there privacy rights in that you may own after you're passed away? Another issue related to that is that there are companies that have arisen that they kind of troll the internet and gather info on individuals who have passed away and then contact their families right after to say, well, I can create this, kind of AI created memory of your significant other or whoever it is that's passed away, which is, that seems like there are some social ethical considerations there that should go into place, right? If you have had someone important in your life pass away, you may not be want to reached out by a vendor saying, hey, here's this, online kind of persona I can make of this person and for you to remember them by, right? Another consideration that goes into that is a lot of these companies that deal with kind of ancestry and DNA, all those companies that you take the test and give them the data, that data is now, it's always been sold. So that's something that people don't realize often. When you're giving your data to all these companies through the AI, through any kind of situation, it's being sold by them. So they're monetizing it, and they're actually selling it and giving access not only to research institutes and all that, but to police and the cops. So they're able to now, they've located several suspects through the use of the DNA that belongs to these private companies have access to. Another compromise of privacy here is the prediction activity that we were talking about. So they take, these algorithms, these platforms, they can take your activity data, your location logs, and additional metrics from your online and smart device behavior and use it to reveal your emotions and beliefs and then manipulate those. So you may be made to have a certain understanding of what's going on or what you believe that may not be in line with reality, but because that's all you're seeing in your online interactions, you begin to believe that. And so people start to have, and we've already seen this, alternate kind of versions of reality and different understandings of what's going on, and it becomes easy to manipulate things like elections. And then we have the issue we were talking about, profiling. So you have this unconsented characterization of individuals who is happening with this AI application. And there's no ability of anyone to really challenge those outcomes to say, hey, the AI was wrong, it shouldn't have profiled me that way. We'll have access to credit, access to employment, housing, social services. And an example of this is the social credit system that China has adopted. So that will create more inequalities and discrimination. So going back to what we were talking about, this monetization by companies of data, data is the most valuable resource today. It's like oil. And companies continue to monetize it. Really, all tech companies are data companies, right? And an interesting way to think about creating more rights in individuals here is there's no way to kind of turn back the clock and get back privacy, right? I kind of think that privacy is dead in the way that we used to understand it. So consider giving individuals a share of monetization of that data. So at least if you're sharing that data, you are getting something back for it. You're sharing in the monetization. An example of this is one of the car companies, I believe it was Ford, has stated that they're looking at adopting a kind of cryptocurrency so that while their vehicle is moving and it's collecting data and sharing that data with Ford, they would pay you back in their coins so that you could then cash that out and have some payment for the data that you're sharing with them and the analytics they're getting from use of your driving information. So another area that's very important to AI development and emerging tech development is liability. So this is the question of who is responsible for losses and damages that's caused by AI error. So traditionally, human operators would be liable, but now there's self-executing machine and code, and machine and code can't be really held liable. They don't have assets. There's not an entity, a legal person or entity to enforce against. So some person or legal entity must be liable when something goes wrong, but now there's ambiguity in the line of causation and fault for any kind of issue that arises, right? Who are we going to hold liable? Is it the responsibility of the developer, the software provider who's liable for the algorithm they created? Is it the manufacturer's liability, the person who created the hardware? Is it the owner of the smart device or product that is liable? And you know what? It may be a mix of these, right? That causation fault kind of tree may apportion different amounts of liability to these parties. So multiple considerations come into play when you're considering liability issues. There are, and these, not necessarily in a positive way because there's not clear regulations and laws in the place yet, and a lot of the tech industry is often self-regulating. That means some of the considerations include company profit and revenue considerations, as well as consumer expectations of performance and safety. So what are some examples of this? So one way to think about it is fines and criminalization of controversial content based being spread on social media. So for example, this past year there was a shooting in New Zealand, and people had video of it, and it was being put on social media and just spread. Well, that people didn't like that. The AI algorithms were not fast enough in catching a lot of that, right? So Australia proposed a bill where they said that because that content was controversial, it should have been caught by the AI faster and more accurately. They were going to create criminal penalties, including jail time, for tech executives of businesses. So that means, for example, if Facebook, Zuckerberg would have faced jail time because the AI algorithm didn't catch the controversial material fast enough. So that's like a bizarre thing to kind of think of, right? Now you have someone who's facing jail time. What does that mean? They're going to be extra, restrictive of free speech in order to prevent that, right? That creates that issue of self-interest that's coming and conflicting with free speech. And if there's a certain country that has that kind of restriction, and they're okay with a restriction on free speech, well, that algorithm is probably going to be applied globally, right? Because it's all one kind of network. So you're going to have other countries, like in the US, where we believe in free speech, our free speech being unnecessarily restricted as well to fit in with another country's restrictions. So that's something where I don't necessarily think it makes sense to create that kind of self-interest by criminalization. You can institute penalties, that will make more sense. Still, you have to be able to navigate that in a way that makes sense, because you don't necessarily want the business to be making decisions, again, just based on monetary values. But that's what a lot of the new laws are kind of looking at. For example, GDPR and CCPA, the privacy laws, do have high fines. Like GDPR, it's up to 4% of global revenue if you violate it, right? So that's a better way to think about it. Another kind of issue there is the autonomous vehicle, kind of AI-driven decision-making process. So when you have these vehicles kind of being adopted on a wide-scale basis, you will have situations where someone's going to get hurt, right? For example, there may be a child that's running across the street and without warning, and there are people in the vehicle, and you either have to, it's a narrow street, so you got to hit the child or, move into the other lane, even though there may be a vehicle there. Well, how do you make all that decisions when you're coding it? Like how does the vehicle make that decision? Does it prioritize, the young child over maybe the older person in the car? Does it prioritize the driver's safety? Does it just prioritize, pedestrians? These are issues where someone has to code this, the algorithm has to make these decisions, and then you have issues about who's liable in that situation. If the car, if the vehicle hits the child, is it the person who wrote the code who's going to be liable for the decision-making process? Is it the manufacturer? So if it's Ford who's creating the vehicle, is it Ford who's going to be liable? Or is it the device owner, the car owner? Is it the person who's actually the passenger but who owns the car who's going to be liable, right? Traditionally, it's been the owner for that kind of situation, but now since it's part of the product, is it really the manufacturer? And when you think about it being, the manufacturer, you consider that they have profit interests, right? They want to make the most profit and revenue they can. So if you have Ford that says, hey, we're going to make this, the AI is going to decide based on who it thinks deserves to, has more of a lifespan left, right? Like if it's the younger person versus the older person, we're going to decide that way, versus another car company, say BMW says, hey, we're always going to prioritize the passenger. Well, the one who's prioritizing the passenger is going to have the competitive advantage and make more money. So, it seems like all of them are going to always be taking into consideration that prioritization of passengers, because you can't really, who would buy a vehicle that might kill them, right? Might not prioritize them over someone else. So you have this issue where that self-regulation doesn't necessarily work. You need that government kind of regulation and guidance to be able to institute some of these social and ethical considerations that governments do and businesses aren't doing. And that kind of ties back to the issue with these kind of fourth industrial revolution technologies that we are adopting on a growing basis. There is a conflict that's happening between companies and states, traditional governments. What's happening is you're getting the corporate state versus the nation state moving forward. And the corporate state doesn't really have the traditional interests the nation state has. It's looking for profits. And do we really want to be in a situation where all decisions are being run by company profits and revenue lines? Another example of kind of liability issues here is individual reliance on algorithms, but then the recommendation was wrong. So think about this, for example, as there's a criminal justice system algorithm that's identifying who is, like pending trial is more likely to commit a crime or is a flight risk, right? So the judge uses that algorithm with the data and lets someone out on bail, and then after bail, they commit a crime, they murder someone. And the recommendation of the algorithm was wrong. So who's liable though? Is it the judge for making that decision, or is it, he relied on the algorithm, so there is no liability there? So that ties into why it's important to put forethought to address some of these issues and these ambiguity if you're a business that's kind of functioning in the AI space. Given that there's this gray, some ways to try to create some clarity for yourself, or at least some protection if this results in disputes, is, for example, attempt to allocate liability through things such as contractual warranties, indemnities, and limitations. Additionally, it'd be important to have the ability to document and demonstrate the reasonability of the AI's decision-making process, as well as the fact that operation of the AI is at least as effective and safe as human-run counterparts. So you basically want to have the ability and the evidence there to be able to document that you're working, in the best industry standards, best practices, and that you have limited your liability to the amount you can through your contracts. All right, any questions? Yes.
Yeah, let me repeat that for the recording. Have you seen case law trends that indicate which direction liability may be going in the case of AIs, may be going to the manufacturer, to the company employing AI, et cetera, et cetera?
So it's still early days. There's not a lot of case law, but there's already, for example, if you, this past year, there was a case where some manufacturer of product to the Navy, some equipment, was actually held liable for products that they had sold to the Navy in 1943. And their kind of warnings and liability kind of protections were considered not adequate, even though they hadn't really been able to, you know, predict how that product was going to be used, some like 80 years later. So there is still a lot of development. Personally, I think it's likely to be the manufacturer where a lot of liability runs on. But these are arguments that will be made in court based on any situation. So if I represent a manufacturer, I will try to argue it's someone else's fault. And again, it goes back to that apportionment I was talking about, because in any situation, it's not necessarily one party that is fully at causation and fault, right? Even the party who's technically the plaintiff could have a portion of liability at issue. So they could be at fault, for example, 30%. So if it's the child running against, if it's maybe the child you can't really give any kind of intent to because, but maybe the parent was right there and the parent wasn't watching. So you're going to say, oh, well, it's the parent's fault, like 10%. So we need to reduce liability by that. So it doesn't mean that the causation fault analysis is just going to be one party. It's more likely to be multiple parties. And realistically, as these situations arise, the person who's injured is going to sue everyone, every party involved, and let the court figure it out, because really they just want to be paid out for the damages. And so whoever's the biggest kind of pocketbook is going to be involved. And if there's any question about it, it's all parties potentially involved.
I was going to say, my understanding is that GM, Daimler, Volvo, and Google have all basically gone on record saying they would be responsible for liability, because if nothing else, particularly in the autonomous car field, there's no market there yet. And there won't be unless the deep pockets accept the responsibility. So I think that's actually probably going to more or less go away as a problem, because that's where the money is. And they understand that if they don't take the responsibility, they won't have a market. There's a guy named Brad Templeton who's been writing a great deal about this, and he talks a lot about the trolley problem, which you say with the kids. And his take, which I'm curious about, is that it's actually a complete red herring, because what the manufacturers are going to do is follow the rules of the road. So you don't break the rules of the road because you can't. If you're baking rules into a car, it cannot swerve out of its lane randomly, because that's just wrong. I mean, that's you can't do that at any time. And so to start breaking that would open them up to huge liability of, well, why did you choose to break the law in this case?
I think that will, work for many situations, but it's not foolproof, right? You'll have situations where something happens that was unexpected, like the child coming out of nowhere, right? And they may not have time to brake necessarily, right? So there's situations like that. There's also situations where the code will go wrong. There's always code error. So it's not going to be a totally, 100% effective kind of resolution. Additionally, the other situation is people can hack him. People can hack these autonomous vehicles and create situations where the vehicle is going to, potentially go to another location, basically kidnapping, to, even in CES, like years ago, maybe 10 years ago, they, remotely blew up a laptop. So nothing's stopping them, hackers, from being able to do that with these autonomous vehicles, right? They all have these lithium batteries that can happen with. So you have the situation of, well, if that happens, again, who's liable for that hack? Was the code not written well enough? Were the security systems in place by the manufacturer not protective enough to kind of prevent those issues?
So your example of the apartment building that uses facial recognition and it didn't work for a certain subgroup, are they really damaged or injured? Because I assume, of course, I didn't recognize your face, enter your PIN, then you get into the building. Just like fingerprint recognition and face recognition on the phone, didn't work that time, enter your PIN, you get in. Is anybody really injured then?
Well, it depends if they have that. As the more and more it develops, they may not have the PIN. And if you're denying people access, or even delaying them, they're being treated in a discriminatory way compared to other groups.
But if fingerprint recognition was shown to not work more for left-handed people,
Fingerprint recognition is
if that was the case, they're not really injured. They have to enter their PIN. Big deal.
fingerprint recognition is historically inaccurate, and that's why it's not even accepted in like criminal law as a way to identify people because it's inaccurate, and it's not being used for. It depends what it's being used for. Housing, there is a key right to having access and not being denied entry to your house, and that's it's a warrant of habitability that you have to provide your tenants. And if you're creating discrimination there, anything that's kind of different, you're creating issues with facing discrimination claims.
I'm curious, you were suggesting that I think that there was a difference in consent between a fingerprint being forced to touch a fingerprint sensor versus having your face exposed to a facial recognition sensor. How is that different in the sense that you can presumably, unless you're being restrained, you can cover your face, et cetera, et cetera. You have to do something to be able to allow it. I mean, obviously it might be faster, but someone can grab your hand and put it on a sensor, and that's forced consent as well. Where's the distinction there?
Well, with the fingerprint, they would have, if they right? Can you kind of, for hours, be just holding your face, right? At some point, you're going to put your hands down, and they can just hold it up for 1 second, and it's open, and they haven't really forced you to do anything, right? They haven't forced you to put your hands down anywhere. It just happened to unlock when they held it up. It's easier to unlock, right? Because it's something like that where the fingerprint, they actually have to either force you to put your finger down, which they can't do. That's not legal. But they can't, force you to just have your face there, right? Your face is already there. Well, I guess I think they can that because that sounds like dangerous. Yeah. Yeah. Yes, but see, it gets harder. You're going to have to get creative in how you're going to try to protect your face for hours if you're being detained so it's easier to unlock.
All right, please, a round of applause.